Hello students, my name is Gaurav Bansal and we are going to discuss the economic survey. Now, economic survey is a big document and to discuss it in a one go is a tough exercise. It is possible, but it will be very long and there will be too much data bombardment on you. So what we have designed here is a 4 session discussion on economic survey. And today we are going to discuss with you the key statistical parameters, or in other words, we can call it the state of the economy, how Indian economy is performing, how we are doing. So how do we analyze any economic performance, any country's economic performance? So if we have to measure the state of the economy, the idea is to capture some of the key statistics, some of the key data from that country. If I want to see how Bangladesh is performing, what are the data I will look at? The first indicator that we always look at is growth. You want to identify any country's economic performance, you look at what rate they are growing. So that is usually the first and the most important parameter, but things do not end here. If we want a broader and a wider picture, then one indicator will not work. We need to look at several indicators. So here we will not only analyze the survey, we will also try to understand how to get snapshot, a broader picture of an economy. And for that, I've prepared a list of 10 indicators which are very important. What are those 10 indicators? We will look at one by one. We can divide them into 3 categories. Okay. As you can see here, growth, stability, and activity. Growth, as I've already told you, is the most important indicator. So, first of all, growth itself, and then the parameters which influence the growth or which directly affects the growth. So, growth, the GDP levels, then it is investment which ultimately leads to the growth. So, apart from growth, the investment is a key parameter which is going to lead to the GDP growth. And then nowadays, since the world has integrated more and more with time, the global capital flows are very big. So now foreign investment also is an important aspect that we need to look into within the picture of investment. Okay. So these are the parameters which define the growth. Then after growth, which parameter do you look? A country may be growing. If it is not stable, then its growth may very well reverse in the coming time. Its growth may not be that much useful if it is not stable. So stability is the second most important parameter. For some, in fact, stability is more important. Because those who have already grown, for them, not growth, it is stability what matters. For example, European Union matters stability or ranks stability much higher than the growth. But for developing countries, growth is more important because without growth, we will always remain poor. Stability, perhaps, just second to the growth for us. Stability is very important, but growth is critical for us to get out of the mess of this poverty. So, how do you look at the stability? So, key parameters with which you can measure any country's stability is inflation. Definitely, the price change is a very important indicator which shows you how stable an economy is performing, how stable is its supply chain, how stable is its demand. Okay, so inflation is very important, and a certain low inflation is acceptable, but within certain limits. After that, inflation hurts you, and if it goes into negative territory, then also it hurts you. The next key indicator is fiscal deficit. How well government is managing its finances, how much loans the government is taking. That is very important here. So fiscal deficit you can never ignore. Okay, fiscal deficit measures so many different aspects. We will talk about all these parameters one by one. Right now, I'm only giving you an overview. So Another important parameter is current account deficit, which measures the flow in the economy from outside, both inward and outward. So, imports, exports, transfers, factor income, everything comes into the current account deficit or the current account. So, current account is a very important parameter with which you can look at a country's stability and its long term. You can make a guess on its long term performance. Another important parameter, okay, is debt to GDP ratio. Debt to GDP ratio. And all these parameters, they are written in the order of importance. So GDP is the first parameters we'll look at, then investment, then foreign. Here also inflation is the most important parameter that government tries to control. After that, it is fiscal deficit. After that, it is current account deficit, then debt. If you take care of two, four is automatically taken care of. In fact, many times we do not even mention debt to GDP ratio in the parameters, but nonetheless, it is an important parameter which you should look at. Controlling fiscal deficit will control it, but you need to know the numbers as well. So debt to GDP ratio is also important. Now the activity. Well, growth, stability are the two most important parameters. But what explains this parameter? What affects this parameter? For example, I know that this is inflation, this is investment. But what if I want to change it? If I want to make a policy on it, for that I need to analyze the activity. So here we come to the third column here, the activity column. So obviously, if I want to look at any country's position, I will look at its growth, I will look at its stability factors. Okay. But if I want to make any judgment on this, if I want to change these parameters, if I want to analyze why these numbers are what they are, then I have to look at the activity. For example, the consumption is the factor that affects the investment. Okay. International trade is the factor that affects the current account deficit. Similarly, tax collection affects your fiscal deficit, debt to GDP ratio, and consumption also affects your inflation. So all these parameters are actually affected by these. So you need to track the economic activity in order to make a meaningful change to these. This is what matters ultimately. So for general public, this is more than enough. Informed, well-educated general public. But for a policy maker, it is activity which perhaps is the tool for them through which they will make these work. So it is in that context that you need to remember these 10 parameters as the most important parameters with which you can analyze any economy. So the GDP, the investment, the foreign investment, the FDI, FPI, okay, inflation, fiscal deficit, current account deficit, debt to GDP ratio, consumption, international trade, and the tax collection. So perhaps you can write down, because it is not just in the context of survey, but otherwise also these are also the datas that you should remember. Not too many datas you have to remember, but these datas, GDP growth rate, investment level, foreign investment, okay, and inflation, fiscal deficit, debt to GDP, consumption, these are the numbers that you should remember. Consumption automatically gives you savings as well. So we do not have to write it separately. Saving is also a very important activity which affects our investment. But you reduce consumption from investment, you get your savings rate. Sorry, not investment, the 100. Consumption plus savings, they are together 100%. So from consumption, we automatically get the numbers for savings. So let us move ahead and analyze these numbers one by one. Let us first look at the consumption and the investment, which are the two very, very important parameters. And then we will look at growth. Growth is affected by investment. So we start with the first cause, which affects ultimately one by one. So we will move to its effect, then the effects likewise. Now, first of all, before we analyze these numbers, just 1 minute on the nature of consumption and its impact on other parameters. See, whenever we make policies, we try to influence the investment levels. For example, when we make monetary policy, we try to cut down interest rates sometimes so that investment may be more. Because if taking loans is cheaper, then companies will be able to take loan more easily in order to open more factories, in order to expand their businesses. And that actually is going to increase your investment level. So that is what we want. That is why we try to cut the interest rate. Similarly, tax is another parameter which encourages the investment. But these are some of the policy tools. The most important factor which affects investment is consumption. Now look at the motivation of a business person who is investing. Who invests? Either the government or the private sector. Government share is very small in the investment and it is largely limited to certain areas. Okay, for example, aspects of human capital. For example, government investment will largely come into healthcare, education system. Then another very important area where government investment comes into is transport infrastructure, defense infrastructure. So government investment is very important for these, but otherwise, how will the production of, let us say, pen is going to increase? How will the production of mobile phones in the country is going to increase? How production of anything that is there is going to increase? So there is this notebook. Okay, there is this notebook. Why a businessman who is producing these notebook will increase production? मैं एक बिजनेसमैन हूं, मैं एक नई फैक्ट्री क्यों लगाऊंगा? Why I will open a new factory if I am a businessman? I will open a new factory when I will realize that demand is increasing, that my current production will not be enough to match my future requirement. This is the most important factor because of which investment is made. Try to understand. So when we try to analyze investment or look at the investment numbers, ultimately it is consumption, it is demand. Consumption and demand is basically the same thing here in this context. So it is demand which encourages a producer to increase the production. And when a producer will try to increase the production, then he will look at other things. That, for example, my first motivation is, मेरी पहली motivation क्या होगी? What will be my first motivation? That my products are going to increase in demand in future, or they are already increasing in demand, and my current factory will not be able to meet my requirement. I need to open new factory. Once I have understood that much, then I will look at the various options. How can I open that factory? From where I can arrange the money? Then all these things, taxation, interest rate, they comes into picture. So first of all, one should be ready to invest. Then he can be convinced by smaller interest rate or lower interest rate. He can be convinced by the tax incentives. So he or she, definitely, both male, female, can open factories and business systems. So it is consumption, that demand, which is giving them the first motivation. So we should always remember that, never forget. So it is consumption revival or consumption increase which motivates the investment. Now, with that understanding, look at the consumption in India in the recent period. Definitely, all of us know that last 2 years have been infected by corona. Economically also, we also have been infected. Our economy is also infected. So slowly, we are also recovering and our economy is also recovering. How the economy has fared, let us look at. The consumption in the country grew by, this is the growth rate of consumption. The consumption in the country increased by, yes. So consumption in the country increased by 5.9%. You can roughly call it 6% in 2019-20, year before the crisis. But last year, which was the first year of the crisis, the consumption declined. People decreased their consumption because their incomes were affected, because there was uncertainty. When there is uncertainty, people try to cut down on their consumption. They only consume what is necessary. or what they deem as important. So some of the expenditures they will try to cut down, and as a result our consumption decreased significantly. Now this decrease was huge in private consumption. Private consumption, consumption by household and firms, which is largely household, that means the people, they decreased their consumption by a big number. On the other hand, government increased its consumption. Government consumption did not decrease. As a result, the overall number is relatively better. Better as in better than this. Okay, it is always a comparative degree. Better is always a comparative number. Somebody may ask, sir, how can we say this situation better? Better not compared to this, better compared to this. So government provided some resistance to decreasing consumption because government kept on investing in infrastructure meanwhile, and government kept on increasing the consumption for various products. So for example, steel, for example, cement, for example, other basic products that are used in construction, government continuously increased demand for those. As a result, despite lockdown, consumption increased in government sector. Now, the ongoing year, okay, already we have spent around 11 months, or 11th month is going on. So now when we look at it, the private consumption now has actually increased. This year consumption has increased by 6.9%. Last year it declined by 9.1%. This year it is improved by 6.9%. That means consumption has not yet revived fully. That means whatever we have seen the increase, it is not even good enough to cover for the loss of last year. That means we are not even at the 2019 level. And this is where we can see recovery over 2019-20. So our consumption in the private sector is still just 97% of what we were consuming in 2019. So our consumption, although is reviving, is still not up to the 2019. But the good thing, meanwhile, is okay, we always have to find certain silver linings. Government consumption has increased considerably. Okay, 2.9 here, 7.6 here. So overall, we can see this much effect. Overall consumption is now almost at 2019 level. Now from here, we can say that 2 years we have roughly wasted away. Not by our choice, given the conditions that we were in, we did whatever best we could, we can say. Okay, so that is the outcome here. If consumption is increasing now, that would also encourage investment. If consumption will continue to increase, our investment rates should also increase. Now let us look at the investment meanwhile. So gross fixed capital formation, this is a good indicator for investment. Okay, gross fixed capital formation. So you can see here that our investment was increasing around 5.4%, let us say in 2019-20 capital formation. And in the pandemic year, the first pandemic year, it decreased significantly. Okay, minus 10.8%. But what we see here is a very good thing, that not only investment increased, it increased by a huge number and surpassing the previous year decline. As a result, overall we see now investment is more than what it was earlier. This is a good thing for India because now our investments are reviving. In fact, what we can say here is our investment are already highest in the last 6 years. I will share the data also very soon. In the last 6 years, or post demonetization, we can say our investment is now at the highest level. So 2016 demonetization was there. Now it is 2022. So almost roughly 5.5 or 5 year, let us say. now our investment has breached the level. And this also is a good thing, meanwhile, because it shows that people are very confident about Indian economy. The producers, the people are very confident about Indian economy. And this also shows one more thing here. See, if you look at the private sector investment, that is not increasing so big. So from where this investment is coming? This is the important question. Investment depends upon consumption. How much is the demand on that investment depends upon. But here, investment is increasing far more compared to the revival in demand. So for what reason investment is increasing that much? Here we need to look at the broader dynamic. A big chunk of the investment that is increasing is also because of some of the international factors. Our export are increasing, and with the COVID crisis and the challenges that we have seen with the global supply chain, and also because of the ongoing trade issues between the Western bloc and the China, more and more producers which had factories in China are looking for alternates. They're not going to shut down their plants in China, but they are also going to look for the alternates. That we should have more plants scattered over world. If supply from one area get restricted, we should not completely shut down. We should continue working from other locations. And this is the reason why, for the first time, China being the factory of the world, that concept is now getting challenged. That concept is now getting reworked by the corporations. So that is something we need to keep in mind here. And India, Vietnam, Thailand, okay, and for example, even Bangladesh in the case of textile and one or two more sectors, they are now being seen as a good production destination. And these countries are able to attract investment not just for their domestic conditions, but from a global perspective. So a lot of investment into India right now is also coming from abroad, and it is also within domestic market also, because we now see a larger export market outside. So that is why there is more revival in the investment here. Clear? So this is a good thing for India. This is the best outcome if we look at all the parameters. You can see exports also. 2019 was already, the last quarter was affected by COVID. Okay, by November 2019, the COVID outbreak was announced in China, and by the last month, the March month of the 2019, already we were facing, or we were witnessing the cases in India. So the point is this, that exports already took a hit in 2019-20 itself. Then 2020-21 we saw a decline, but now we see a big revival. And it is this export which are also driving our investment. So little later I will talk more on the exports. Okay. So we have seen the changes in the consumption and investment. Now very briefly look at their level. So our consumption out of total national income was around 71.7%. Okay. And now we estimate our consumption as a proportion of GDP to be around 69.7%. Okay. Why this number has decreased? We were saying that consumption has revived. This number has decreased because investments are also increasing. So what is happening here? Companies are spending more on investment rather than consumption. So consumption as a proportion has decreased. Try to understand it. Consumption may be increasing, but at the same time, savings, investments are increasing faster than it. This is the reason why the share of consumption in the GDP has fallen. Absolute number, if we look at, consumption is still almost the same level at 2019. But in the share, it has fallen because in the same time, our investments have increased over their previous level. And as a result, the share of investments, the savings has increased here. And here we can also see that the private consumption share was close to 60%. 0.5%, and now it is reduced to 57.5%. The share of private sector has gone down, and government meanwhile has emerged as a big consumer, and that is because they're spending a lot in infrastructure. Okay, and meanwhile you look at the investment has increased its share in the GDP, and this is the reason why the consumption has fallen. So numbers sometimes can increase in their absolute sense, but as a proportion they may fall. Okay, so for example, our GDP increases at 8%, agriculture increases at 4%, services increases at 8%, industry meanwhile increases at 9%. If you look at the end of year, the share of agriculture will fall, because agriculture, although it increased, but it increased slower than the other sectors. And when we look at the entire GDP, it is the combination of all the three. If two are running faster, the third, even though he may be fast, will still be slower. I mean, that is not a good example. A good example would be, let us say, there are three students in a class, okay, and one student improved marks from 35 to 45. Meanwhile, other students increased their marks from, let us say, 45 to 75. So this person, although has increased, but still his rank will go down. Okay, his marks has improved, but his rank will still go down in the class, because he thought by scoring 45, he will now come into the better category of students, those who were scoring 45. But meanwhile, the students which were scoring 45 have also jumped. They have gone to 75. So that is something, the kind of relationship here we have. So consumption overall may not have declined. It is almost at the same level, but as a proportion, it has fallen, because meanwhile investments or the savings have increased. So this is something that we need to look into. Now let us move to the next. Okay, we have seen the consumption, we have analyzed its importance and performance. Now let us look at the next. Now we are talking about another important activity which is very impactful on the economy, the tax collection. The tax collection then has an impact on the deficit. So first of all, let us look at the direct tax collection. The direct tax, if we look at, their numbers have fallen. Okay, this is in the ratio of GDP. In 2018-19, the direct tax to GDP ratio was close to 6%, and it has fallen. Why it has fallen? Because in the last 2 years or in the last 3 years, the corporation taxes have gone down significantly. This is the reason. When we talk about direct taxes, just give me a minute here. When we talk about direct taxes, largely we talk about the corporation tax. Okay. Either we talk about the corporation tax or we talk about the income tax. Income tax has not fallen. Income tax is roughly the same level as it was, but it is the corporation tax which has fallen. Because of COVID crisis, government gave many incentives, many tax concessions to the companies. In 2019, we also cut our corporation tax rate. That was also responsible to some extent. So overall, our direct tax to GDP ratio has fallen. Okay, this is direct tax to GDP ratio. It was 6%, it has fallen to 5%. Meanwhile, indirect tax collection is roughly the same. In 2018-19, it was 4.9% of GDP. Today also it is 4.9% of GDP. Here the silver lining is our our GST collections are improving significantly. And in the coming years, we are going to expect a revival in the indirect tax income. And similarly, in the direct tax income, there should be a revival, because the corporation tax collection should now improve. Okay, corporate activity is now improving. The production is going to pick up. As a result, the corporate tax collection will also come. So this number is definitely going to get affected by the economic activity very badly. As a result, we see a big decline in the direct tax collection. consumption has not fallen. Indirect taxes on consumption. You have seen the consumption levels. Our consumption level in 2021 and 22 are roughly 99% of what they were earlier. It's roughly the same. As a result, you see the same tax collection. Our tax rates have remained the same. And if this number has not changed on which tax is applied, then automatically taxes are going to be collected in the roughly same manner. So consumption since overall has not changed in the last 2 years, as we've seen on the last slide, the indirect tax collection has not changed. Okay, in the direct tax collection, we see decline because corporate activity, corporate profitability, and the taxes have gone down. Now let us look at the next number. Tax to GDP ratio is a total of these, so that is explainable. This is a big problem for India. Already our tax to GDP ratio is very low. First of all, this number is of the center government. This number does not belong to this number is of central government. This number is not of entire India. If we talk about debt to GDP ratio, sorry, tax to GDP ratio of India, then the tax to GDP ratio of India would be around 17%, 16%, because that would be center plus states. This is only the number of center. So right now we are talking about tax to GDP ratio of center. Tax to GDP ratio of government of India. Government of India is center. Okay, so alternatively we can also write like this. Tax to GDP ratio of government of India. So this has fallen. Now tax to GDP ratio is very, very important because it is tax to GDP ratio which ultimately affects our various responses. First of all, response ability to emergencies. Tax to GDP ratio, this defines your resource base. Okay, tax to GDP ratio defines or in fact it creates our resource base, and it is on resource base that our ability to respond to emergencies depend upon. Then in developing countries, welfare is very important. Our ability to bring welfare measures, that is also affected by the resource base. And then our ability to invest. Investment, for example, in infrastructure. Infrastructure, defense, all of that. Okay. So all of this depends upon the resource base. That is why increasing tax to GDP ratio is very important, because a larger resource base is always better. Our numbers are much lower compared to the international averages. So just to get an idea, the tax to GDP ratio, for example, in India right now is around 16%. This is center's number. If we put states together with center, it is around 16% today. It has fallen. At one point of time, it was 17.5%. For example, in China, this number is around 21%. For example, in other BRICS countries such as Russia, Brazil, South Africa, in all these three, this number is more than 30%. So the states in those countries have a large resource base, much large resource base compared to India. Europe, you will be surprised to learn some of the numbers here. In Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, this number is close to 50%. France, Germany, this number is close to 40%. So states there have much larger capacity to build infrastructure, to bring welfare, to respond to emergency. In India, this number is very small. That is why we see relatively poor quality of infrastructure, although there we have made a big improvement. Okay, that is why we see inadequate response from the government. You change the government. I'm not concerned about the political party. You bring any political party, it will be constrained by the resource base that we have. And that is why it matters a lot. Okay, that is why tax collection is such an important economic indicator of the government, because it ultimately decides a government's resource base. And these are some of the number you should remember. All the data, key data the rememberable data I'm discussing today in this session. If you want to really, many times students ask that, sir, which data we should remember? Economy has a lot of data. My answer is these data. The 10 data that I'm discussing, the data on these 10 parameters. Please try to remember them. And you can remember them if you remember the trend. You just cannot mug up the numbers, but you can remember the trends. You can remember a story. So that is what we are discussing here. Now, tax collection definitely affects the deficit. Because if tax collection is low, government has to take a loan to meet its expenditure. And that is something that we need to look here. How tax collection has affected our deficits. Since tax collection has decreased meanwhile, let us look at how much deficits have changed. Look at here. Our fiscal deficit, okay, that has increased very strongly here. Because this tax collection in 2019-20, the number which is not here, it was even worse. It was even poor. It was close to 4.6%, the indirect tax collection here. Okay, our consumption decreased. Even our direct tax collection was less. This year, it has improved from the previous year. So we see as our economy gets into a worst mode due to the COVID crisis, the fiscal deficit increases. Government needs to borrow. Why? First, the tax collection goes down. Secondly, it needs to spend more in order to respond to emergency, in order to improve and extend the welfare measures. So as a result, a massive increase in fiscal deficit. This fiscal deficit is highest in the post-reform period. After 1991, this is our highest fiscal deficit. The good thing is now we are coming out of it in a way. This year we are likely to make a sharp improvement. This is a very sharp improvement. Okay, we have now in fact seems to have come off better than the previous year. Okay, by this time, since data were not entirely collected, because the economic survey comes in the mid of a financial year, the numbers are given for the first 2 quarters for each year. So that is why these numbers are not really the actual fiscal deficit numbers, but it is here for the sake of comparison. So here you can see fiscal deficit first of all increases hugely and then it declines. And this is good for us. So that means now we need to borrow less. And in the coming years, this ratio should go down further. Ideally, a country should not be borrowing more than 3% of its GDP. Okay, so our fiscal deficit should not be more than 3%. India was managing around 4% for a long time. Long time, I mean, before 2018, from 2014 to 2018, if you look at, our fiscal deficit decreased from around 5% to around 3.8%. So we made an improvement and we were close to that 3%. But now we are once again in a unstable category, in unstable trajectory. But since this is because of a sudden event, a one of a kind event, we should not look at it very seriously. Perhaps after 2 years, when we have properly come out of crisis, then the number of fiscal deficit would be more meaningful. But we can see the impact of COVID here, a big increase here. Okay, primary deficit. If we remove the interest payments, okay, from fiscal deficit, if we reduce the interest payments, then we get the primary deficit. So primary deficit also shows that we have increased our spending and this year we will decrease our spending hugely. That is why a big improvement in primary deficit. Primary deficit should be 0, while fiscal deficit ideally should be around 3%. Now let us look at the other parameters. Now let us talk about the growth. Here I do not have to discuss too much. These numbers are self-explanatory. Okay, the COVID situation affected the services sector worst. As a result, the worst number we will see in services here. So this is our number for industry, sorry, agriculture, then industry, and this is services. So Look at this number. This is an outlier. In entire economy, when there is decline, agriculture did not decline because agriculture was not affected by the COVID crisis, not at all affected. Okay, roughly the same numbers. Even we look at the past 10 years, the average agriculture growth would be around 3 to 4%. That is what we are managing. So agriculture performed how it was performing. In fact, performed better in the last 3 years. So agriculture seems to be doing better here. And it was agriculture sector performance, in fact, which somehow restricted the fall in growth rate. Okay. And if we see over 2019-20, then agriculture output is now 8% higher. Okay, roughly 8% higher. Meanwhile, industry, 2019 was specifically bad year for us. Okay, 2019 we were already in slowdown before the crisis, before the COVID related crisis. The industrial activity in India was very badly affected by a number of factors. That was also the time many of you have heard where a infamous data was often quoted that even Parle-G biscuit is not selling. So consumption was very badly affected. As a result, investment, industrial activity all were affected in that year. 2019-20, apart from COVID, was also bad year for us. So we see industrial decline in that year. Then as a result of COVID, because of the lockdown, because economy was shut down for a certain period, we see fall in output. So here, naturally, there was fall in output. But this is a good number that we see. That industry is not only improving, is not only recovering, it is actually getting a surge ahead. And I've already explained the reason because there is a lot of investment in the industry today. The manufacturing is coming out of China and looking for alternates. Manufacturing in India is reviving, and that is a good thing because it is manufacturing that can create jobs for us. So manufacturing is seeing a kind of revival. Okay. And meanwhile, the mining and quarrying has also seen a big increase. Look at these numbers. Within industry, the manufacturing is actually reviving. This number is not because of construction. Some people might say only the industry's number may misguide you, because if a government invests too much into infrastructure, that itself can generate a lot of industrial activity. But here it is not just the construction activity that is going on. Okay, construction related industry we have already separated out here. The construction has increased as a handsome rate, at a good rate, but manufacturing apart from construction is also increasing. That means there is some good momentum here, and the reason, as I've told you, is because we see a good future in exports, because we are sort of becoming a global manufacturing hub. It is the very early days, and I should not even use the term global manufacturing hub. Perhaps we are becoming an alternate, or we're becoming a small hub for manufacturing. Okay, regional hub perhaps. Once we grow large and large in that context, maybe after a point of time we can start calling ourselves a global hub, but we are not anywhere close to that at present. So even these numbers are meaningful if we want to analyze the broader number. Why? Where industrial activity has improved. Okay, mining of course is improving, and manufacturing is very heartening to see. It's great to see our manufacturing witnessing a sort of revival. And then services. Services were doing well, have always been doing well in India. India has a natural edge in services. But because of COVID, it was services which was affected worse. And the reason we can see here, where in services we had decline. In the financial services, hardly any decline, 1.5%. So finance, IT, etc. were not that badly affected. Okay, it was largely from the trade, hotel, transport that we see a 20% decline. And as a result, the services had the highest decrease. Naturally, all of us are aware of, I do not have to explain why hotels had a decline, why transportation had a decline. So this number is comparable here, understandable here. Now we can say services have now recovered almost to their previous level. Okay, overall now services are close to 99% of what they were in the pre-COVID period. And in a way, services are reviving, but ultimately it is the industry which has seen the biggest growth and biggest revival here. And this is a good thing for us, that service is reviving. Service is not doing bad, but it is industry which is now leading, because industry is also capable of creating large number of jobs. So this number matters for us. And when we look at the overall GDP, the overall GVA, then in 2019-20, our GVA, our GDP growth rate was poor. I've already told you that was bad year. And then the last quarter was already affected by COVID. Then in 2020-21, the provisional estimate, it is decline of 6.2%, largely saved by agriculture. If agriculture would not have performed as it did, this number could have been bad, worse. This is our worst performance since independence. And not only India, many of the countries have had their worst year in the last 50, 70, 60 years. For example, South Korea, for example, Singapore, for example, Malaysia, many of these countries, they also had similarly the worst year in the last 50, 60 years. This is our worst performance. We never had economic decline earlier. It was largely whether growth rate is high or low, not a decline. This is a decline. But the silver lining is this year we are reviving, and we are reviving handsomely. We are reviving well. We can call it a true V-shaped recovery. What a V-shaped recovery looks like. For example, you are growing like this. Okay. Okay, this is our GDP. GDP with time is growing. Okay, let us say this is time. Okay, 18, 19. Likewise. Okay, let us say this is 16, this is 17, this is 18, and this is here 19. In 2019, we see a fall, but in 2021, we see a V-shaped recovery. This is how our recovery is. Okay, we are where we should have been if this crisis was not there. This is our revival. This is a true V-shaped recovery. That 1 year we decline, but the very next year we not only cover up the loss, but we are surpassing it. Okay, so that is a true V-shaped recovery. Now we can say on the basis of this data. Just a minute. Okay, so something like this. To be more accurate portrayal, something like this. Okay, perhaps if this crisis would not have happened, then we could have been here. Okay, but then at least we have recovered from this. From this number, we are already above. That is what we are doing. So we can see here our GDP is now higher than, or our production level is now higher than what it was in 2019. And this is a good recovery given the situation. This is natural now. Since agriculture has performed well throughout this period, its share in the GDP has increased. Okay, from 18.4% to 18.8%. Similarly, we see industry here. The share of industry has also increased. Okay, roughly to 28%, because industry is now witnessing a serious revival. And services, their share is declining in GDP. Okay, this could be a good news for us actually in the long term. That COVID can be a blessing for us disguise in the long run. For short run, for 2 years we had loss, we had everything, but in the long run, if it can lead to a manufacturing revival in India, it would be a great thing, because manufacturing revival will address a lot of issues in India. For example, regional imbalance. For example, small town economy. For example, employment question. All of these can be tackled by the manufacturing growth, the industry. In 2011, do you know what target we set for the next 10 years? That from 2012 to 2022, next 10 years, we will spend encouraging our industrial output. At that time, share of industry was close to 20%. And we were targeting that we should having 25% share of industry at least. We can now see here that we already surpassed that target in 2019 itself. And now we are well above that target. This is good for us. Okay. This is largely an outcome of the previous data. So this is understandable and very straightforward. The share of various sectors in the GDP. The trade, the hotel industry, the transportation, that had the serious decline, particularly the hotel and transport. And we can see the share of hotel, transport, tourism that has fallen GDP by worst number. In fact, the share in the decline in the share of services is largely because of this. Other sectors have maintained their share. Okay, so finance is still around the same. The other services are still around the same as a proportion of GDP. Largely, the decline is witnessed by the tourism, the hotel industry, the hospitality industry. Let us now move to the next data. The next is international trade and BOP. So far we have discussed certain indicators. We started with 10 numbers. Out of those 10, if we really look at, we have discussed consumption, okay, investment. We have also looked at the tax collection. After tax collection, we have also looked at the fiscal deficit, and we have also looked at the GDP and sectors. We have also analyzed the GDP in sectoral. So we have discussed half of the most important indicators. Now let's just look at the rest of them. So whenever we want to look at the trade, the first number that we look at is generally the merchandise trade, the trade of products. Okay, in the product export, what is our performance? In the product export, if we see month by month, now our exports, okay, this is export, the dotted pink line, we see a big revival here. Okay, now constantly we are scoring numbers that are close to 30 billion US dollars. And this year we are going to touch $400 billion worth of exports. This is our export for 2021-22. In the first 9 months itself, we have touched $300 billion, and now we are going to touch the total software export or the total export of $400 billion in products. Okay, and if we look at in services, okay, this is the net, okay, import minus export minus import, and here we can see a constant surplus that every month we make more than $5 billion surplus in the services. So we see from 2019 level, we are already above. Meanwhile, for certain period, here we were registering software export more than $8 billion per month, surplus of more than $8 billion per month. So in services, we are doing well. This year, we are expected to look a services export worth $250 billion. Okay, you can write down these numbers. You can very easily find these numbers. So 2021-22, the ongoing year, we expect our exports to be worth $400 billion. In the first 9 months, we have surpassed our exports of 2019. Not the COVID affected period, even the year prior to that. This is our highest export ever. This is our highest services export ever. So in trade, we have broken our previous records in a way, and we have registered good increase. So that is there for us to see. So trade, exports, we are doing well. Okay, and when we talk about imports, that is where we have a sort of trouble, because our imports are consistently higher than our exports, and there is a big gap between our exports and imports. However, the good thing is that the loss because of the gap here is largely covered by other aspects, and one of them is export in the services. In the services export, we have surplus. In fact, it is the surplus that we are looking here. And here we are looking at the deficit. This gap is the deficit. Okay, so this is basically our trade deficit that we can mark out, the gap between exports and imports. So bit of a trouble area, but overall our exports are increasing and increasing faster. Clear? Now let us look at the current account balance. The trade itself, we have seen the exports are increasing faster. The services exports are also doing faster, getting almost a record number. What is the impact on the current account balance? The current account balance, if we see, for brief period was also into surplus. Okay, and since then also in percentage of GDP, okay, it is hardly around -1%, which is manageable. So India's current account deficit is manageable around -1% at present. This is not too much of a problem. And if we include the capital account, then there is continuous surplus in BOP. If we look at the broader BOP, current plus capital account, then we have a surplus here. So look at the numbers again. This is where our trouble area, where we have the big gap between export and imports. We can see this gap here. Okay, so imports are increasing faster than our exports, and there is big deficit, a deficit of around $200 billion, but sorry, $150 billion. And then the good thing is it is covered up in large part by services itself. Our services export surplus is around $85-87 billion. That is good thing for us. Okay, so this largely covers up more than half of our trade deficit from here. And then the another good thing is we have a lot of remittances. Lot of Indians live abroad and they send a lot of cash back to their family, lot of money to their families. So that also gives us a lot of foreign exchange. That is why, despite a big loss here, if we look at the current account balance, the current account balance is not very bad for us. Okay, for brief periods, we in fact sometimes have surplus as well. And overall, this number is not too much unmanageable. It is around -1%. If we can address this problem and bring this number to 0%, our problem will largely be resolved here. And overall, because India is also attracting a lot of foreign investments, overall we are net receiver. We are getting a lot of foreign exchange from abroad. So here we have a surplus in the BOP. And if you continuously have BOP surplus, if every month, every year you are getting more foreign exchange than what is leaving your country, then your foreign exchange reserves will increase. As a result, we see a big increase in our foreign exchange reserves. From roughly a level of $450 billion, we have reached a level of $650 billion. And here you see a big jump in our import cover. Sorry, this is our import cover. That our foreign exchange today, reserves today, they can cover more than a year of imports. That much foreign exchange reserves we have here. So that is very good for us. Our foreign exchange reserves gives us a very comfortable situation. This is the only problematic picture for India, and we need to do something to address it. Government has introduced a lot of schemes like PLI, etc., to address this problem. Okay. Now let us look at the last of the numbers. And if you are getting a lot of foreign exchange reserves or foreign exchange in your country, your currency should also do okay and not do very badly. And as a result, here we see that from November 2020 to November 2021, in the last 1 year, our currency overall has been stable. It is minus 0.3%. That means a small depreciation. Doesn't matter too much, small fluctuations overall can always be there, and India is among the better performing currencies here. So that is good for India. Some countries like Turkey, Sri Lanka, Argentina had very bad currency movement meanwhile. And now another key number, and that is foreign direct investment. The foreign direct investment to India are at their highest level in our history. And we are getting more and more foreign direct investments. These are the quarterly numbers, and we can see that roughly around $10 billion worth of foreign investment we are continuously getting and surpassing that number on large number of occasions. Okay, only on 2 occasions or 3 occasions we have gone slightly below 10%. Okay, these are the times when we have been below it, but in majority, in maximum periods, we have surpassed it. So our foreign direct investment is crossing $10 billion per quarter. Okay, and overall, if you see the number, you add up any numbers here, the overall flow to India are good. Here also we are maintaining in the first 2 quarters roughly 22% of $22 billion of foreign investment. To give you the perspective, India is continuously either the first or the second top FDI receiving country in the world. And this partially explains the increase in investment in India. This FDI is also driving investment in India. Okay. Now the last indicator, and that is inflation. So we need to look at the pattern of inflation. There are two parameters that we look at, and that are WPI and CPI. So what does this number tells you? CPI and WPI, Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is largely stable around, or it has largely been below 8%. Okay, so we can see here, and this is our 4% line. So inflation is within the band of 4 to 8%, which is slightly higher than where we would prefer it to be. Our ideal CPI line, our inflation, ideal inflation is between 2 to 6%, which is also the target for the Monetary Policy Committee. But it is slightly higher than that. But the good thing is, after spending a long time in the higher side of it, now it is largely below 6%. So it is within the target range for last more than 1 year, and that is good for us. So it is the consumer price inflation which is under control. But meanwhile, if we see WPI, it has increased to a very high level. The wholesale price index, that means for customer, the prices have not increased that much as they are increasing for producers. It is becoming more and more expensive to produce the things. This is what it explains. That means profitability is falling. Businesses are taking on the loss on themselves and selling products at roughly the same price as earlier. Okay, and why WPI is higher than CPI? Usually CPI is higher than WPI. But why this is happening? The reason is the global supply chain. And this is our last slide as well. So there has been a supply side disruption. I will read it out quickly here. As the world economy recovered in 2021, it is faced with a serious supply side constraint, ranging from delivery delays, container shortage, and semiconductor chip shortages. The storage of containers has also impacted the Indian sea trade. Okay, so from here we can see that there is big supply side issue, and particularly because of container and semiconductor. First of all, chips are in shortage. They are not being manufactured in the same number as they were earlier, and the demand is also very high, particularly for the production of cryptocurrencies. So that is affected. And secondly, containers are very badly affected. The container supply is affected. Because containers are not available, the international trade has become more expensive and there are delays there. And this is what is explaining the increased cost of production. Okay, so by how much it has increased? The freights have increased by almost 300% to 350%. Okay, by this much, the shipping charges have increased. For example, if I wanted to import a container, if it would cost me $1,200 2 years ago, today it will cost me $4,000. So this is changing the entire dynamics, and this is a big problem. For example, even car industry in India is very badly affected. You want to purchase any car, today there is months of waiting, not because these cars are popular, because manufacturer is unable to produce them in the adequate number. So this is very bad situation. And because to address this supply side issue, now companies are trying to establish manufacturing facilities across the world to not face this problem in future. Here we can see some data also that the chip shortage has affected over 170 industries. And there is a delay of around 6 to 9 months, whereas usually the gap between the registration of demand and supply is 18 to 20 weeks, 4 to 5 weeks. This is increased to 6 to 9 months. This is the problem for global economy, not just for India. These are some of the data which explains the issue. Okay, so year on year change in different shipping routes, flight rates. So for example, if you want to send a product from Shanghai to Los Angeles, the shipping cost have increased by 168%. This is the problem part. Just a minute. Yes, this is the problem part. In other areas also, in general, there has been big increase. And you see here, the increase is not that much in the Atlantic Ocean. It increases largely around from Shanghai to other regions. Okay. And similarly, the World Container Index, sorry, my tongue is slipping. How much it cost to hire a container, that has increased from $666 or the $1,200 number I gave you, which was a stable number for a long time. Today, it has gone up to $10,000. This much is the increase. Very, very bad, very, very high increase, affecting the entire global trade and international prices. Okay. And this is the inflation levels in the past 3 big crises that India has faced in 21st century. The first was 2008 global financial crisis. Second was a currency crash in 2012-13. And third is the pandemic. If we see, our performance today is more satisfactory in terms of inflation. Okay. Compared to the previous 2 crises, our inflation is under control. During global financial crisis, our inflation was 9.1%. Taper tantrum, which was when Indian economy or Indian currency crashed in 2012-13, then also our inflation was high. Today, inflation is in much better control. Meanwhile, deficit is in bad shape because it has taken a huge toll on our deficit. And fiscal deficit, okay, this is where again, as a percentage of GDP in EMI, that is where we are bad. And if you look at the current account balance, here we have again a silver lining. We are not that much affected on the international flows. Okay, and external debt as a percent of GDP is not also affected. So overall, except deficit increase, we have largely come out unscathed. We largely come out without too much of trouble out of this crisis if we compare to the previous 2. Okay, so this is a good number that we can look into. This slide can be provided to if you want. Okay, we can give you a download link for that. So these data you can also read in detail later on. And this is the estimate by the World Bank that how much India is expected to grow, or all the economies are expected to grow. And the good thing is, India is the topmost economy in this parameter. India declined by one of the sharpest number, but India is also going to increase. This year, our growth rate is highest. Now this year is almost complete and this number is well known. And even in next year, 2022-23, our economy is likely to maintain the momentum and is expected to increase at a very high level of 9%. So Indian economy has emerged out as a sort of in somewhat beneficiary situation compared to other countries out of the COVID. So because it has led to some sort of manufacturing revival in India, some sort of industrial revival in India. And since we have seen, compared to the last crisis, India has done very well in controlling the inflation, the current account deficit, etc. So we are coming out better. So our macroeconomic situation is not as bad as it could have been, and our performance is not that bad. Okay, of course it would be bad, but it is not as bad as it could have been. So overall, this is our future outlook, and we are likely to do well in the future. So this is the state of Indian economy. And I hope this session has helped you to understand and grasp the issue properly. And we will meet you with more sessions, and we will discuss, for example, trade and other activities in Indian economy in more detail in coming sessions. Thank you.